All 140 seats in the General Assembly are up for grabs, and with a new map in play, power may shift from red to blue. A special city council election with a long list of contenders, the winner may be the deciding vote on major city projects. And the thousands of young voters in the Commonwealth. Which issues drive you to the polls and why you should care about election 2019? It's not the splashiest election. No presidential race, no governor on the ballot, but it's an important one. The entire General Assembly is up for re-election. Those are the state delegates and senators who make Virginia law. And in Richmond, there is a special election to fill a city council seat. It all happens November 5th. I'm Orzo Hadjigurban, and our team of reporters at VCU put this guide together for young voters. We're going to break down the key races, introduce the candidates, and talk about key issues. To start, let's talk about you. Young voters have a reputation for not turning up on Election Day, but as Shakila Schulterbrand reports, around here, that's not the case.
The VCU Student Commons is normally a place where people go to hang out, but on November 5th, it becomes a polling place. VCU students have a pretty high voter turnout, but in an off-year election, will that still be the case? In 2016, over 60% of VCU students cast their vote, beating the national average of 50%.
Students and young people in Virginia actually have it quite good compared to other institutions and other states.
But that was a presidential race. In an off-year election, turnout is much lower. Political science professor Amanda Wintersack says young people are still a key voting bloc.
And they're looking at national data instead of looking at the local data that shows that VCU students are voters. So it's actually to their detriment not to seek the input and votes of these students.
VCU professor Alexandra Reckendorf says that it's not that young voters don't care as much as older voters, it's just that it hasn't yet become a habit.
They don't know what they're doing. We know that voting is a habit, and so they've not yet been habituated to voting.
As for how to mobilize young voters, Reckendorf says social media is more effective than traditional media. Studies show that even small things like Facebook's I Voted sticker helps motivate voters.
If you see friends are participating in politics, you might be more apt to participate in politics.
Reckendorf says young people care just as much about issues in government, they just have a different way of engaging in politics.
Things like social activism, boycotting, protesting, taking to social media, that kind of stuff.
A little over 50% of Virginia millennial voters turned out for the 2016 election, but last year for the governor's race, only about 47% turned out. Reporting from VCU, I'm Shakila Schulterbrand.
If you want to see if you're registered to vote and where your polling place is, here's what to do. Head to elections.virginia.gov. Enter in your name and address, and the interactive map can show you where to go. You had until October 29th to request an absentee ballot. Unfortunately, if you haven't registered yet, Virginia doesn't have the same-day registration. Once you've found your polling place, here's what you should bring on Election Day. You need to have a form of photo ID. Some acceptable forms of ID include a driver's license, an employer-issued photo ID, or a United States passport. A student ID is also acceptable as long as the school is located in Virginia. If you don't have one of these forms of identification, you can get one for free at your nearest voter registration office, even on the day of the election. See the full list of acceptable ID at elections.virginia.gov. So, which races will you see on your ballot? Depending on where you live, you might be weighing in on one of the big Senate showdowns in the Richmond area. All 40 seats in the state Senate are up for re-election. In Senate District 12, Republican Siobhan Donovan is defending her seat against Democrat Deborah Rodman, and you might have seen their faces before. Hannah Eason has more on the district that became the first Virginia Senate race to spend over $1 million in TV ads.
Both candidates are one of only 37 women who currently serve in the General Assembly, and collectively they've spent almost $2 million in media ads in this competitive District 12 race. Incumbent Siobhan Donovan has served in the Senate since 2016. Her opponent is current House Delegate Deborah Rodman, who is leaving her spot in House District 73 to challenge Donovan. The Virginia Public Access Project classifies the race as competitive. Donovan is a Republican, but the district has voted Democrat in the 2018 U.S. Senate and 2017 governor elections. One of the issues the candidates disagree on is the solution to gun violence. In a debate hosted by Virginia Public Media, Donovan focused on a mental health hotline and universal reporting.
In Parkland, there were 31 complaints about that individual before he ever went to that school. They weren't centralized, nobody knew, nothing was done.
Rodman would like to pass what she calls common sense gun laws, but she says the General Assembly would need a Democratic majority in order to get anything passed.
Talking about universal background checks. It takes 5 minutes to, have a background check to make sure that the person who's buying that gun should be buying that gun.
In September, Rodman outraised Dunavant in donations by more than $300,000. Dunavant's contributions were mostly thanks to out-of-state donations. Of the $160,000 she raised, less than $30,000 were from in-state. A majority of Rodman's donations also came from out of state, though the split wasn't as severe. Both candidates currently serve in the Richmond area, but have conflicting opinions on the removal of Confederate statues. Rodman feels that it should be up to the local government to decide.
Oh, I definitely, localities, when it comes to Confederate monuments, that should come up to the localities to make their decisions about what they're doing. This has been, of course, an issue for a while. We need to make sure that we have accurate information and history in Virginia. And of course, this brings up, a lot of difficult and important discussions about race, and we should continue those discussions.
Dunavant says she does not think that the monument should be removed.
I have not supported in the past localities having the ability to remove statues of any kind. I think you learn by discussing history, and you learn by what you did well and what you did poorly.
You can see my full interview with Deborah Rodman on Twitter. Just search VA Votes 2019. Reporting from the Capitol, I'm Hannah Eason.
Another key race in the state Senate is happening in District 10. Glenn Sturdivant won his seat by about 1,500 votes back in 2015. He's a Republican in a district where Democrats usually win, including Governor Ralph Northam in 2017 and Senator Tim Kaine last year. Evan Neri has a closer look at the candidates.
With all the yard signs and over $1.5 million worth of campaign ads, this is a race that's hard to miss. Here's where the candidates stand on the issues that matter most to young voters. The voters in Chesterfield County, Richmond, and Powhatan County have a choice to make. The options: incumbent Senator Glenn Sturdivant, an attorney first elected in 2015, and his challenger, Democrat Ghazala Hashmi, an educator who is running for office for the first time. The candidates have different ideas when it comes to the issues of education. In a debate earlier this month, the two clashed over university funding.
Restoring funding for our public schools is the number one step, our first step that we have to achieve.
To make sure we are funding them well, but they also have to have skin in the game and understand that the cost of college has gotten completely out of control.
I had the chance to talk with Ghazala Hashmi about what she thinks is the most important issue facing young voters.
Critical issues that I hear repeatedly from young folks are, what is my future going to be like? And the climate crisis is at the top of their list. They understand that we have to make some changes immediately.
Glenn Sturdivant did not respond to our request for an interview, but earlier this year, he wrote an editorial about college affordability, saying, "Limiting tuition increases is just part of that puzzle, but it is a very meaningful step for students struggling to afford their education." Gun control is another major issue that's come up on the campaign trail. Hashmi says she supports universal background checks, banning bump stocks, and banning assault weapons, and making sure red flag laws are in place. Sturdivant's campaign website lays out his views on gun control. He supports red flag laws, which restrict gun rights for people determined to be a threat, and he says he'd support legislation to arm teachers in public schools. You can see my full interview with Ghazala Hashmi on Twitter. Just search VA Votes 2019. Reporting from Monument Avenue, I'm Evan Neri.
You'll also see House races on your ballot. The 100 seats in the House of Delegates are all up for re-election, and there's a big shakeup this year: new maps. Last year, a U.S. District Court said 11 of Virginia's House districts were racially gerrymandered. Federal judges selected a new map that will be in effect on November 5th. As Jonah Shuhar reports, it could mean big changes.
I'm standing here at the intersection of Belvedere and Spring Street in the 71st Voters District. If I stood in this same spot less than a year ago, I would be standing in the 69th. These maps weren't supposed to be redrawn until after the 2020 census, but last year a federal court ruled that 11 House districts were racially gerrymandered, meaning that they've been drawn to favor one party based on racial demographics.
Well, the logic behind that for the Republicans was, who control the legislature, is that if you have that one district with 55% minority, the districts around it are going to be heavily Republican.
The new maps were drawn by a court, not by lawmakers, and there are some big changes. According to the Virginia Public Access Project, 6 Republicans are now running for re-election in districts that tend to vote for Democrats, which may pose a problem. Political science professor Ernest McGowan says Republicans running in newly blue districts have to change strategy.
It's going to definitely make them emphasize different issues. We're hearing a lot about education, right? What we call valence issues, issues that cut across party lines that everyone agrees with.
McGowan says there's still hope for Republicans to keep their seats.
And so there may be a question as to whether or not that Democrat mobilization is actually going to be enough to overcome the traditional mobilization machines of those Republicans.
Democrats need to flip 3 seats in order to take control in the House. Now, the district I'm standing in is majority Democrat, but according to the Virginia Public Access Project, there are 23 other districts that are highly competitive as a result of these new maps.
One of the districts most affected by the new maps is House District 66. House Speaker Kirk Cox has held the seat for 30 years, but the new map makes the district highly competitive. Katie Mooney is in our newsroom with more.
According to the Virginia Public Access Project, redistricting moved this district over 30 points in the Democrats' favor. District 66 includes Colonial Heights and Chesterfield County. Here it is before redistricting, and here it is now. Republican Kirk Cox is facing a challenge from Democrat Sheila Bynum Coleman, who previously ran for delegate in another district. Cox was first elected to the House in 1989. He's the current House Speaker. We weren't able to talk to Cox about issues that matter to young voters, but in previous interviews, he's focused on the cost of higher education.
For me, everything comes down to the next generation succeeding. That's what I was about as a teacher. That's what I was about as a coach in the House of Delegates.
Democrat Sheila Bynum Coleman told me she believes criminal justice reform is the biggest issue facing young voters.
Virginia can legalize the adult regulated use of marijuana and decriminalize it and allow people who have been in prison and convicted of our bad marijuana laws that they can be released from prison and their records can be expunged.
On the issue of gun control, Cox and the Republican-controlled House ended a special session on gun violence without taking action. Cox tweeted, "The VA House GOP will steadfastly fight to defend the Second Amendment rights of law-abiding citizens from far-left gun control proposals this session." Bynum Coleman says she supports several gun control measures, especially after her daughter was shot.
I want to see universal background checks. I want to put a knot in the loopholes at the gun shows. Every firearm sale should have a universal background check, and that's it. That's the bare minimum.
Again, we weren't able to get an interview with Kirk Cox, but you can see our full interview with Sheila Bynum Coleman by checking out our Twitter page at VA Votes 2019. Reporting from our Richmond newsroom, I'm Katie Mooney.
Another key race we're watching is District 72, where Republican Gay Donna Vandergriff is challenging Democrat Schuyler Van Valkenburg. Jasmine Sneed has a closer look at the candidates.
House District 72 was represented by Republicans for nearly 3 decades. Democrat Schuyler Van Valkenburg flipped the seat in 2017, but now he's facing a challenger trying to turn it red again. Over 80,000 people live in this district that spans from Tuckahoe to Glen Allen. Incumbent Democrat Schuyler Van Valkenburg is facing a challenge from Republican Gay Donna Vandergriff. Van Valkenburg teaches at Glen Allen High School. Vandergriff currently serves on the board of a mental health advocacy group. Some of Van Valkenburg's top issues: access to high-quality and affordable health care, reinforcing school safety, and protecting women's reproductive rights. According to Vandergriff's website, some of her top issues are healthcare, education, and the environment. Van Valkenburg says he would like to see increased funding to public schools.
First is that when you invest in education, you're investing in something that creates economic growth. Henrico, if you look at Henrico, for decades, it's been a place with world-class schools, and that brings in business, that brings in families, which creates a high quality of life and attracts educated workforce.
Gay Donna Vandergriff agrees that teachers need a pay raise and schools need an increase in state support.
They want more time, smaller classroom sizes would help with that, and that is set at a state level.
Healthcare is an important issue for both candidates.
We must address rising costs of treatments and prescriptions while maintaining coverage for pre-existing conditions.
Sure, well, with the opioid crisis, first we need to look at it as the public health issue it is, and we need to start to address that. And Medicaid expansion was a great way to ensure that people had the access to health care that they needed, but of course we know that's not enough.
According to the Virginia Public Access Project, the recent redistricting shifted the 72nd towards Democrats, but only slightly. Reporting from our Richmond studio, I'm Jasmine Sneed.
Nearby in House District 73, another highly competitive race, this one between two first-time candidates for office. Deborah Rodman previously won the seat in 2017 when she beat out longtime Representative John O'Bannon by 900 votes. She's now running for Senate, leaving the 73rd House District wide open. Andy Riddler has a preview of this race.
Democrat Rodney Willett and Republican Mary Margaret Castleberg are both hoping to represent voters in Henrico County. Here's where they stand on issues that are important to young voters.
The new district maps may have shifted the 73rd slightly more Republican, but it's still a competitive race, especially with two political newcomers. Both candidates have a background in business. Democrat Rodney Willett is a technology consultant, while Republican Mary Margaret Castleberg is a financial services advisor. They're also similar when it comes to some key issues, with Castleberg breaking away from her party's traditional stance on gun control.
In my view, if you go to a public gun show to purchase a gun, you should have a background check.
She also supports red flag laws, limiting magazine sizes, and closing the gun show loophole. However, she opposes any sort of weapons ban and stops short of calling for universal background checks, which is something Willett supports.
So I think it's time for universal background checks, doing something about the magazine sizes, limiting that, and then a red flag law, with due process provided.
When it comes to health care, more differences. Castleberg says on her website that she wants to protect patients with pre-existing conditions and that she opposes any form of Medicare for all. Willett wants to expand Medicaid and chose to highlight prescription drug costs in one of his campaign ads.
No cost. Now Rodney's running for delegate because he knows it shouldn't take a good deed.
I reached out to the Castleberg campaign but was not able to get an interview. I did talk with Willett, and when I asked him to name the biggest issue facing young voters, he didn't hesitate to say climate change. You can check out that interview on Twitter by searching VA Votes 2019. Reporting from my Richmond studio, I'm Andy Riddler.
In the final House of Delegates race we're watching, District 68, where Democrat Dawn Adams is hoping to hold on to her seat in a district that became more Republican under the new map. The voters in parts of Chesterfield County, Richmond City, and Henrico County will choose between Adams, a nurse practitioner and business owner, and Garrison Coward, who has worked in politics behind the scenes but is running for office for the first time. The candidates have different ideas when it comes to the issues that matter to young voters. Delegate Adams told WTVR she was disappointed the General Assembly did not pass gun safety legislation in its special session this year.
And so it's really important that we listen to that as legislators and come together and decide, there are measures that we can take and at the same time preserve the Second Amendment rights that people are concerned about.
In an interview with VPM, Adams says there's public support for several changes to gun laws.
Universal background checks, one gun a month, limiting the purchase of, high capacity magazines. I mean, these are just sort of reasonable proposals that I think most Americans across, at least, from everything I've read, people agree on those things, even gun owners.
Garrison Coward told WTVR that he agrees that addressing gun violence is a priority.
For me, it's making sure that we have mentally ill folks and violently radical individuals not getting access to these weapons.
In an interview with VPM, Coward said he supports more resource officers in schools and doing more to address mental illnesses. He also said he's open to red flag laws and universal background checks. The candidate's website also shed some light on their priorities. Adams' list starts with affordable health care, then education reform, protecting the environment, job creation, and responsible government spending. Coward's website lists education, crime and safety, encouraging growth for small and medium-sized businesses, government accountability, and health care. From the Capitol building to City Hall, 7 candidates are hoping to land a spot on City Council. The election is to replace current 5th District Councilman Parker Agilesto. He moved out of the 5th District last year. He planned to finish his 4-year term, but facing legal battles over his decision to stay, he announced his resignation in April. Now, 7 candidates are hoping to finish out his term, which ends December 2020. The new council member would then need to run again for a full term. We were able to sit down with 5 of the 7 candidates to talk about why they should get your vote. You can find the full interviews on our Twitter page, but here's a quick introduction.
I'm Erica Moken, and I sat down with 5th District candidate Stephanie Lynch. Lynch's background is in social work and has built a career as an advocate for access to health care and mental health. During Lynch's interview, she talked a lot about making the city government more transparent and improving trust between the public and city leaders. Some of the specific priorities she mentioned included working alongside the Richmond School Board to improve schools, getting additional state funds for the city projects. As for the Navy Hill redevelopment plan, she says she's a no based on what she knows as today. She also mentioned her thoughts on property real estate tax. You can see more about Lynch's interview by visiting her campaign website, electstephanielynch.com. You can also see our entire conversation by visiting our Twitter page, VA Votes 2019.
I'm Brad Vassar, and I sat down with City Council candidate Thad Williamson, who's no newcomer to Richmond politics. Williamson is an associate professor of leadership studies at the University of Richmond. He worked with Mayor LeVar Stoney in 2016 as an advisor on his policy platform. On the issues, Williamson told me he'd like to see City Council focus more on creating social change and advocacy to improve the city of Richmond. He says that a better budget is what will allow for his success in office. Williamson also talked about his plan for Richmond City Public Schools and issues with the current City Council. If you want to know more, you can watch the full video by looking for VA Votes 2019 on Twitter.
I'm Adjua Henderson, and I had the chance to talk with City Council candidate Jermichael McCoy. He stopped by to discuss relevant issues within the city and why voters should choose him to represent the 5th District. As president of the Urban League of Richmond, he's heavily invested in the community. He says he wants to focus on better career preparation for Richmond's youth, as well as provide proper funding for Richmond City's public schools. We also discussed his stance on the very controversial topic of the $1.5 billion renovation of the Richmond Coliseum. He says he's a no on the project as it currently stands, and he explains why. Watch our full interview on our Twitter page by searching VA Votes 2019.
I'm Jessalyn Hayes, and I had a conversation with candidate Nicholas De Silva. At 21 years old, De Silva is the youngest candidate, but he says people shouldn't underestimate him. A working-class citizen and recent VCU graduate, De Silva told me he is fighting for all Richmond residents to have their voices heard. He believes the current city council is pushing an agenda for the elite, but he wants the working class to have more power. His campaign features 5 key issues that he wants to focus on: housing for all, funding public schools, police accountability, food and transportation justice, and economic empowerment. De Silva says if he is chosen by the 5th District, he wants it to be his full-time job because that's what the people of Richmond deserve. If you want to hear more, head over to VA Votes 2019 on Twitter for the full interview.
I'm Ava Lolita Hansen, and I talked to candidate Mamie Taylor. She told me that community inclusion is a key issue for City Council. She wants more local workforce involvement within the city instead of using outside contractors. When I asked her about how the city spends its money, she said she wants to take the time to look at city spending line by line and see where the money is going. She does not support the current Navy Hill redevelopment plan and had a lot to say about why. We also talked about property real estate tax and potholes. You can see my whole conversation with Mamie by visiting our Twitter page, or check out Mamie's Twitter page at Mamie T for the 5th.
We were not able to set up interviews with candidates Robin Mines and Chuck Richardson, but all the candidates recently did a Q&A with the Richmond Times-Dispatch if you'd like to learn about them. Now, let's get to why all this matters, the issues. A recent poll from the Washington Post found that a majority of Virginians say they're prioritizing health care, gun policy, and education this election. Gun policy came out as the top issue, with 3/4 of Virginians saying the issue is very important to their vote. Only half of those polled said President Trump was important to determining how they'd vote, and only about 1/4 said Governor Northam would be a factor in their decision. As for the issues that matter most to young voters, the rising cost of college is consistently named a top concern. Trey Smith looked into what Virginia lawmakers could do to fix the problem.
Here on VCU's campus, students saw a tuition freeze for this school year, but it was the first time tuition had an increase in nearly 2 decades. Anaya Sprague says she's trying not to think about how much student debt she's racking up.
I don't know how I'm going to do this, but I'm going to have to figure it out because I think I'm like $17K in debt right now.
Most students who graduate leave with not only a degree, but a financial burden. 6 out of 10 Virginia college students graduate with debt, owing an average of $30,000. Partners for College Affordability advocate Stacey Gordon says it has major consequences for this generation.
Starting families, buying houses, a lot of these major life milestones, they're not hitting where the previous generations have hit.
Partners for College Affordability has certain laws in mind that it would like to see passed in Virginia.
So we were big advocates of a bill called the Public Comment Bill. It requires the boards of visitors at every institution to hold a period of public comment before they vote on tuition increases.
Partners for College Affordability also supported a state budget measure that awarded additional funding to public colleges that froze tuition. Students like Sprague say it's good that the cost of college is becoming a political issue.
Thinking about that, it makes me really, really happy. I'm not exactly sure why this isn't something that has already happened.
And with VCU's tuition nearly doubling in just the last 10 years, this is an issue that's top of the list for many young voters. Reporting from VCU's campus, I'm Trey Smith.
Another major issue that affects young voters' wallets, minimum wage. Right now, it's $7.25 an hour. As Ryan Yurka reports, some lawmakers have tried to increase it, but so far, they haven't had enough votes.
The minimum wage is a major issue for young voters because that's what a lot of them are paid, especially when they first enter the workforce. I looked into where Virginia stands on bumping up that base pay. 29 states have passed legislation to raise the minimum wage above the federal minimum of $7.25. Virginia isn't one of them. Several bills to raise the minimum wage were proposed during the 2019 General Assembly session, but none of them went through. VCU economics professor Leslie Stratton explains why some lawmakers may hesitate to raise the minimum wage.
So equipment, machinery that can substitute for workers. So again, the literature generally shows very little effect of a change in the minimum wage on employment levels. But if you're talking about a large change in the minimum wage, I think then you would see an effect, and I think there is a long-run effect.
She also points to a common misconception about the impact of higher minimum wages.
There's a lot of move now to increase the minimum wage to $15 an hour, and I understand that. The idea is you want it to be a living wage. But again, if you're seeking to help the working poor, the minimum wage to a large extent goes to teenagers and young people. And they're not working poor, they're living at home, being supported for the most part by their parents, not all of them, obviously.
A poll from the Washington Post shows 9 in 10 Democrats favor an increase in minimum wage, but less than half of Republican voters do. For those who want to leave it at $7.25, a common concern is the impact on small businesses.
So thank God we pay our employees well, but if goods get raised in prices, then we'd have to raise their pay as well, just because it'd be the right thing to do so they can provide for themselves and their families.
The last time the minimum wage increased in Virginia was in 2009, when it increased to match the federal minimum. Democrats say if they can gain control of the General Assembly, they may be able to bump it up. The minimum wage could also go up in Virginia if the federal minimum wage goes up. This year, the U.S. House voted for an increase, but the bill didn't make it through the Senate. Reporting from our Richmond studio, I'm Ryan Yurka.
Another popular issue among young voters, legalizing marijuana. A Gallup poll last year showed a whopping 78% of young people support legalization. Bria Hill has this report.
Marijuana is mostly illegal in Virginia. Only medical use of THC and CBD oils is allowed, and only in specific circumstances with a doctor's approval. But as public support for legal pot grows, will Virginia laws change? 11 other states have legalized marijuana, but Virginia is not one of them. A recent study from the University of Mary Washington shows that 61% of Virginians support recreational marijuana. That support goes up to 80% when you look at Virginians under the age of 25. Executive Director of the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, Jen Michelle Padini, says that keeping marijuana use illegal doesn't stop people from using it.
Every year that Virginia chooses not to legalize and regulate the responsible adult use of marijuana, what it's effectively saying is that we would prefer for criminal enterprise to be the, quote, regulators of the industry.
And argues it's safer to make it legal.
We know that drug dealers don't ID, they don't label and lab test their products. So implementing a state-sanctioned regulatory model, as we've done for medical cannabis, is really how we move towards achieving those public safety goals.
Decriminalizing marijuana also plays a role in criminal and racial justice. Jenny Glass of the American Civil Liberties Union of Virginia says that the Commonwealth is routinely in the top 10% for arrests for possession.
What we know is that you're still much more likely to be arrested for marijuana if you're a black than if you're a white. In Virginia, the most recent statistics are 2.8 times more likely.
According to a report from the Attorney General's office, 90% of marijuana-related arrests last year were for possession alone, and possession arrests increased 115% from 2003 to 2017. Lawmakers introduced bills last legislative session that would have legalized marijuana for those 21 and up, but those bills never made it out of committee. Supporters of legalizing marijuana argue it could be a great source of revenue for the state. The bills proposed last session featured a 10% tax on marijuana products. Reporting from our studio, I'm Bria Hill.
Big issues, big races, and hopefully big turnout from young voters. Check out any of these stories and interviews with the candidates by going to VA Votes 2019 on Twitter. And remember, polls open at 6 a.m. on November 5th. Reporting from our studio at VCU, I'm Orzo Haji-Gurban.